The story of King Arthur is one of the most important stories in Western literature. Almost without having to think about it, most of us can conjure up the basic framework of the story. There's Arthur, there's Guinevere, there's all of the knights that are in England, the Round Table, the story of Lancelot and his adulterous affair, or at least his adulterous, jealous love of Guinevere. There's the story of the Holy Grail, as the knights of Arthur go out seeking the cup that Christ had used at the Last Supper. And this cup, this Grail, was supposed to have magical properties associated with it, sometimes to heal, sometimes to give long life, and, at least in the later account, the Grail gives eternal life. And today there are all kinds of opinions of the Arthurian legends. Some have gone so far as to say that the Arthurian legends were chauvinistic, that it was a male-dominated world, that the way that they objectified women in the idea of courtly love was chauvinist, that it was machismo run amok, that the Arthurian legends, while romantic and while interesting and sort of provocative, instilled, some say, a sense of the wrong sense of male leadership as being that of warrior class mentality, that to be a man, one had to go off and fight, and that to be a woman, one had to be a damsel in distress, pining away back at the castle. And despite these modern views of Arthur, the fact remains is that that view, that the Arthurian legends somehow created or codified or instilled a sense of martial ethos into the identity of a man. In fact, historically, it's quite the reverse. In fact, as we'll see in this lecture, knighthood was originally very barbarous. That coming out of the reign of Charlemagne and others in the early Middle Ages, the church had a problem on its hands with the sheer amount of violence that it was dealing with. The violence of the warrior classes, the lords of the feudal manors, the castellans, those who owned castles, who ruled over the populace with a somewhat iron fist, taking extravagant taxes and these kinds of things. And so actually, what the church does in the Middle Ages, particularly into the High Middle Ages, is it attempts to take the warrior ethos out of the idea of a knight, and it seeks to redirect it. That far from creating the concept of a man who is off at war all the time, what the church seeks to do, in most cases, is to tone down the concept of fighting as the identity of being a knight. And they redirect them instead to the concept of love, service, honor, and bravery. And so in this lecture, we're going to be looking at knights and chivalry. And we're not going to just be looking at how they fought, though we are going to look at that. And we're not just going to be looking at their armor and their swords and some of the gallantry and the stories of the chivalric code. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the issue of knights and warfare and violence in the early Middle Ages. And we're going to seek to understand how the church addressed the issue of violence in the Middle Ages. Lacking any coercive power, the church turned to winsomeness, turned to rhetoric, turned to appeals for a better life for those who were the fighting classes. And this is important, we're going to say, not because this was just a blip on the screen, but in fact, knights and warriors and warfare are going to comprise so much of the subsets of the stories of the Middle Ages. The Crusades and the fights that are going on out in the Near East and Asia Minor are predominantly led by and driven by knights. And many of the wars, as nations rise up in the Middle Ages, are going to be driven by the military power and might of the knighthood. And so this lecture takes on two parts. Who are the knights? How did they fight? And why is this important for future history? And then secondly, we're going to look at the question of the church's role in attempting to curb the violence. And we'll begin with just how the knights fought and who they were. Now, in the later lecture, we're going to be discussing the three estates. And in that lecture on the three estates, we're going to be looking more specifically at culture at large. And we're going to note where knights and nobility fit into the structure of society itself. But in this lecture, we're going to be looking at knighthood itself, warrior classes themselves. And the first thing we can say is that coming out of the reign of Charlemagne into the early Middle Ages, what we begin to see is a kind of amorphous group of people who are warriors. In general, if you lived around the year 1000, or even as far back as 800 or 900, to be a knight did not actually mean that you were quite upper class. In fact, very often it meant that you were part of the blue-collar class, you might say. A knight was kind of a grunt. Now, they were a grunt that had some means of wealth. More on that in a second. But those who were at the top tier, Charlemagne himself, would never have considered himself to be a knight. He would consider himself to be a lord, part of the head of the entire army itself. But the knights were in order further down the rung in terms of the honor due those who were knights. And what happens is from about the year 1000 on into the High Middle Ages, and we can give a rough date of about 1300 here. So over about 300 years, what begins to happen is the order of knight becomes more or less fixed. So back shortly before the year 1000 or right about the year 1000, if you were a knight, you very well could have become a knight simply by the fact that you bought a horse, you bought a sword, you learned how to use it, and then you went off to war. So to be a knight really meant nothing more than you had the paraphernalia and the weaponry required of a knight. And more so, those who were rising up the ranks from knighthood on into land-holding, say barons or dukes, these kinds of things, that boundary was permeable as well. We see all kinds of people who, through their prowess in battle, rise up, and as a result, they get land rewarded to them for their victories. And then shortly thereafter, generations upon generations, the land-holding knights become more or less nobles, or at least they have the capacity to rise up. But what happens is over these 300 years, from about 1000 to 1300, the orders of knighthood and nobility become more or less fixed. And that is in large part due to the fact that the wars themselves, the battles in Europe, very often were between neighboring groups. So a knight in this region and a knight in that region, say, might very well go to war if one knight decides that he wants more territory for himself. And so what you see happening over these 300 years is the nobility themselves, those at the top rung, don't like the fact that they are vulnerable, you might say. And so they do a number of things in an attempt to try to solidify their hold on the higher rung of being a nobleman. We see, for example, the emergence of coat of arms, the idea that you would put your family crest on a shield, and only those who were noblemen could do this. And so therefore, if you had a shield and a coat of arms that you could display, that indicated that you were noble. If you were a late-born knight, if you were something of a usurper, well, you didn't have a coat of arms. And these things were tightly regulated. You couldn't just simply make them up. You had to have them approved at certain various levels of society, usually by the king. We also see the nobility by 1300 beginning to stress their bloodlines, beginning to stress that they have noble blood in them, that their father and their grandfather and on back to some historic figure is the reason why they are noble. It's not because they themselves necessarily are good at battle or war or these kinds of things, but rather they rule because their family has always ruled. Therefore, again, if you're a lower-rung knight, if you're a castellan, that is to say, if you were maybe a wealthy knight who managed to get enough wealth to own a castle or build a castle, well, it didn't mean that you were a noble anymore. If you didn't have a coat of arms, and if you didn't have a good bloodline, the most you could be is a wealthy, lower-rung knight. And the last thing the nobility begins to add is they add patronymics. Now, today, we're very accustomed to patronymics. We all, for example, have last names. When you were born and the birth certificate was filled out, you were given a first and a last name. Now, in most cases, the last name was pretty fixed. You were given the name of your family, often the name of your father. Now, in the modern world, of course, we've gotten used to hyphenating our patronymics, our last names, and that's a new thing. But by and large, we all have last names. Well, this wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. A patronymic, or a last name, that indicated what family you were a part of, became, over time, one of the hallmarks of being part of the nobility. So if you were Charles of, say, Orléans, if you were from the House of Orléans, well then that indicated that you weren't simply just Charles who was a Fletcher or Charles who was a blacksmith, but that you were Charles of a noble house. And only those who were in the nobility, by and large, would use patronymics. Those who were peasants, those who were feudal vassals, those who were knights, very often were unable to do this. So, to conclude this bit, what we could see is that over the course of 300 years, from 1000 to 1300, what happens is you see a dividing between the knights and the nobility. Now, the obvious question is, what does the knight look like? Now, of course, in movies and in art and in all kinds of things, we see very often a knight looking a very specific way. Usually, they are wearing armor, and usually it is plate armor that you see a knight wearing. Now, in the early Middle Ages, just after the time of Charlemagne, and on into the High Middle Ages, plate armor actually isn't the norm. That is to say, you wouldn't see a knight wearing plate armor from head to toe like you very often see if you, say, go to a museum. You see these old plate armor statues standing, and you can see them. Very often, a knight in the early days would wear a mail shirt, something that would deflect a blow but wouldn't necessarily be too cumbersome. You could put it on very easily. You'd wear a lot of padding to take blunt trauma, and at times you'd wear some kind of a helmet, something to protect your head. What marked a knight in the early Middle Ages and on into the High Middle Ages was not so much what they wore, but what they rode. A knight always was someone who rode a horse. In fact, the word chivalry comes from the time of Charlemagne, and a chivalry was a payment owed to a warrior who sat upon a horse. So eventually, chivalry becomes synonymous with a horse soldier, or a horse-backed soldier. So in other words, a knight is somebody who is attached to a horse. And a horse in these days is not inexpensive. They're a good bit of a challenge to upkeep. Purchasing a horse is usually quite steep. Keeping up with the horse, feeding it, taking care of it, and these kinds of things was not a small feat. And in fact, this is what divides those who are knights and those who are not very often. It is the purchase of the horse. The other thing that a knight very often became associated with was the lance. And of course, we're very used to this image as well, a knight on a horse jousting with a lance. But it took some time, actually, before the lance became couched. That is to say, before it became couched under the arm and secured in a very specific way. In the early Middle Ages, very often the lance was something you would swing, or it would be something that you would try to poke someone with, stab them with. The problem here, of course, is momentum. If you're riding on a horse and you have this big, long stick, and you reach out and you overextend, or even worse, if you're trying to hold it just with the strength of your hand, and you actually crash quite hard into something, and you strike them true, and you actually hit them, say, on the chest, well, the blow of that very often would be enough to knock you off the horse. And so over time, from about 1000 on, two inventions come in that dramatically affect knighthood and chivalry and warrior classes who rode on the backs of horses. The first was the invention of the stirrup. Now, we're not quite sure when this came about. There was a time when it was believed that the stirrup came about hundreds of years earlier. It seems to have come about and come into dominant use about the year 1000. But the use of stirrups is actually very important. With the stirrup, the knight is able to sit on the horseback with a lot more strength and leverage. The other thing that the knights eventually develop is the idea of a couched lance. That is to say, to be tucked under the arm. Sometimes there'd be some sort of mechanism to sort of wedge it in under your arm so that the lance, in other words, becomes essentially an extension of your body as a whole. And so now with your feet in the stirrups and the lance couched under your arm, you can actually drive the lance home with much more force and with all the speed and the weight of not only the knight, but of the horse itself. So in the end, when we look at knights and the cost associated with keeping up arms and horseback and all these kinds of things, and on top of that, very often, the need for a squire or a vassal to tend to the horse or to tend to the armaments whenever you were away, the cost associated with becoming a knight was quite high. And because of the high cost, because of the cost associated with all the things required to be a knight, what happens is the natural proclivity amongst the warrior classes to go to war and the constant need for land so that they could tax the subjects, so that they could keep up with their costly lifestyle of war, often precipitated more war on top of it. And so actually in the early Middle Ages, we see a significant amount of fighting. And this is particularly the case where we have not a strong central leadership. So in some parts of the former Frankish kingdoms, particularly out east in the areas of modern-day Germany, the leadership out there was a good bit stronger, more centralized, more driven by the lords and the barons and these kinds of things. In modern-day France, however, in that area of the former Frankish kingdoms, what you have is a breakdown of the central government or the central authorities that would be in charge with keeping the knights and the castellans in order. And so war begets war begets war. The warrior classes, with the need to find more land and find more taxable income and the need to conquer their neighbors, would often be at war at all times. And, more importantly, those who were innocent, those who were caught between two warrior bands, the lay people, in other words, would very often suffer the consequences. And so how does the church address this? How does the church in the West seek to put a stop to the ongoing strife and warfare, and in particular, the innocent shedding of blood of the peasants? Well, essentially, the church takes two tactics. And the first is they scold the knights and the warrior classes. And they issue a number of pronouncements or decrees designed to stop the warrior classes from fighting, at least in some ways. And the most famous case of this is what we today call the Peace and Truce of God. And the Peace and Truce of God was an attempt by church councils in the West to issue edicts as to when knights and nobility were able to fight and whom they were allowed to attack during their wars. Now, people have found this to be quite strange, again, but you have to see this not as the opportunity of the church to bless fighting, but rather as an attempt by the church to stop in some ways. But rather as an attempt by the church to stop fighting, at least on the margins. They know they can't put a stop to fighting in general. The church does not have that kind of power. And so with the Peace and Truce of God, what you see happening is an attempt by the church to curb war. And the Peace of God was a proclamation made in 989 at the Council of Charroux. And in this council, the Peace of God argued that the defenseless, those who are not bearing arms during a war, were not to be attacked by any one of the warrior classes. So if a knight is out on war and he somehow finds himself with innocents and knights between them, it is illegal now, at least according to the church, for the warrior classes to attack the innocents. This is called the Peace of God. Those who are defenseless should not be attacked, the church says. If you're going to go out and fight, only fight yourselves. Do not fight those who are unable to fight back. The Truce of God comes several years later, in the year 1027, and this was another council meeting in southern France. And in this council, the Truce of God proclaims that knights were not allowed to fight on certain days. For example, they couldn't fight on Sabbath. They were not allowed to fight on holy days, feast days, and these kinds of things. And it stipulated that knights and warrior classes should seek not to fight during certain times of the year, during the harsh winters, for example, when food was already scarce and people were already hunkering down, that to go out and go to war and then to potentially ravage a village or these kinds of things would actually do more harm than if it was done in the summer. And there were other texts as well, scolding texts, you might say, texts designed by the church to sort of wag its finger at the warrior classes for its wanton warrior desires and its bloodthirstiness. And not surprisingly, these books and the Peace and Truce of God really only had a limited effect, because noble classes don't really like to be scolded. Again, these are sort of dumb jocks that they don't need the principal coming into their locker room telling them what they can and can't do. And for the church to sort of wag its finger and tell the warrior classes what they need to do really, again, only had a marginal effect. Now, some knights eventually would abide by these rules, particularly the ones designed to not attack the innocents. But by and large, the church could not curb violence. And so, as we move from the early Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages, what you see happen is you see the church itself seek to redirect the energies of the warrior classes to something more noble. In other words, The chivalric code, this ideal that a knight was supposed to live by, of bravery, honesty, virtue, of giving oneself to a maiden or some kind of virtuous woman and doing whatever she bids you do, or if she is in trouble, saving her. All of these kinds of virtues were actually invented and codified and shaped, not by troubadours or by the secular world, we might say, but rather they were shaped by the poets and the writers who were associated with the church itself. And what the chivalric code does is it takes this warrior ethos, this hot-blooded desire to go out and wage war, and it redirects it, the same intensity, and it redirects it for things that are better, things that are more noble. So just look what the church does here. As the texts develop and as the chivalric honor and as this ideal, this romantic ideal of being a noble knight, of doing one's best and being brave and never giving up the fight, and, more importantly, of doing the bidding of an innocent woman. Notice what's going on here. This is profoundly interesting that the church is saying, you knights, you who are bloodthirsty, going out, listen to the women. Listen to someone in the castle who doesn't seek as much warfare and bloodthirstiness and battle as you do. Listen to the women. Listen to how they will direct you. They will send you on noble errands. They will send you out on errands that are worthy of your prowess. Don't go fight the knights in the nearby village or in the nearby castle. That's not noble. That's not virtuous. Unless, of course, they are themselves evil, and then you're being sent to put down evil itself for the sake of virtue. So what happens over the course of 300 years is the church itself begins to redirect, almost like a carrot on the stick, holding out a different ideal of what it meant to be a warrior, of what it meant to use your strength and your prowess and all the things that you've trained for all these years, use them for good, is the desire of the church. And by far, the most important figure in the development of the chivalric code is a man who lived and wrote in and around the 12th century, around 1150, and his name was Chrétien de Troyes. And we Englishize it today, and we'll say Christian of Troy, but Christian was an author. Today we'd call him a troubadour, that is to say he was a public performer of songs and sonnets and poems and these kinds of things. But Christian himself was actually a chaplain. He was a pastor, and he served the Count and Countess of the area of Champagne in France. And what Christian does is he begins to write down all kinds of chivalric codes and stories and all kinds of things that he believes mark a knight as being good and godly and obedient and trustworthy and brave. And by far, the most important stories that Christian begins to write down are those associated with King Arthur. And Christian writes a number of different stories. Two of them are the most important for the development of the Arthurian legend. He writes a book about Perceval and the story of going off to find the Holy Grail. And Christian's work is the first to do this. It is the first to even discuss something called a Holy Grail, or this desire of this knight Perceval to go out and discover this grail, this cup that gives life. Now, a lot of people have seen in Christian's work here an allegory, where Perceval, this knight, this warrior, is being encouraged not to use his honor and his glory and his strength to go after his own gain, but to go after the cup of Christ. And of course, there's obvious Eucharistic overtones here. Seek the church, seek the sacraments. And the story itself, though, this quest for the Holy Grail, is a desire to see a knight using his prowess for good. The other story that Christian gives us, and he adds for the first time to the story of King Arthur, is this story of Lancelot. This story of one of the knights under King Arthur who falls in love with King Arthur's wife, Guinevere. And, at least at this point, the story is, of course, a bit salacious. According to the Middle Ages and according to lots of generations thereafter, falling in love with the queen, falling in love with your sire's wife, was not a good thing. It was adulterous. It was punishable. There were all kinds of problems with this. But what is interesting about this story, and what is not always noted, is that what Lancelot does is he does not attack and kill Arthur. He never does that. Actually, what he does is because of his love, because of his lust, frankly, because of his impure desires, he actually swallows them. He hides them. He suppresses them in the story that Christian gives us. He doesn't go and murder his lord and take the throne and take Guinevere for himself, but rather he seeks glory and honor, and he seeks to win her respect by doing good, by following the proper chivalric code. No blood is shed within the Arthurian house itself, and rather Lancelot sublimates and suppresses his impure desires for something that is pure. Now, the last thing to say about Christian's works, beyond the allegorical interpretations and beyond the obvious impact of the church, is that it is written in the vernacular. A lot of the attempts by the church to wag its finger at the knights and those who were going off to war was written in Latin. And by this time, by the 12th century, as you're moving further into the High Middle Ages, increasingly you have those who are unable to read Latin. Rather, they are reading in this time, in this day, they are reading Old French, that is to say, a precursor to modern French. And Christian is, by and large, one of the first serious writers in Old French, in the vernacular. And not only that, but scholars have noted, he is the first not to just write a series of episodes, a series of disjointed stories, but rather that Christian writes an entire story with 3 parts, beginning, middle, and end, the classic 3 acts that you see in plays and in books and all kinds of things all the way down until today, that Christian writes this in the vernacular. He is seeking, and he is among the first, if not the first, he is seeking to win lay hearts and minds by appealing to them in their own tongue and in their own way. And so in the end, as we look at knights and chivalry and all of these things, don't get lost in the romanticism of war or in the romanticism of the joust and the tournaments and all these kinds of things, as interesting as those things are. And don't get lost in a kind of backwards reading of chivalry, as if it were some attempt by the church or by the Middle Ages to suppress women or to wrap manliness up with being a warrior. In fact, as we've said, the church's desire from beginning to end in dealing with the chivalric code, in dealing with the desires and the virtues of being a knight, was an attempt in a very pastoral way to curb violence, to seek in whatever way it could through the church to put an end to the desire to always act out in violence, to always go to war, to always fight. And, more importantly, knights now must listen, and knights now need to listen to women. They need their partners. They need people to speak into their lives, we might say. Their goal was not to simply be machismo, but, as chivalry said again and again, follow those whom you love, listen to them, and should jealousy, should envy, should any of the baser desires rise up, as it did for Lancelot and as it did for many other warriors, suppress it, push it down, fight against those, and fight instead for virtue and nobility and all of the virtues of chivalry itself.